The Civil Rights Movement lasted from 1954 to 1968. During this time, blacks united in protest against the unfair laws that impacted their daily lives. They could not eat at the same restaurant, sit in the same bus seat, or even drink at the same water fountain as a white person. It was a humiliating system that angered many blacks.
And then in 1961, 13 people boarded a Greyhound bus headed south. 7 blacks, 6 whites.
We could not sit on the front seat of a bus. We had to go to the back, and that was a kind of humiliation that black people had to endure every day. Freedom rider is a person who saw something wrong and decided to do something about it.
Freedom Riders were a group during the Civil Rights Movement that protested segregation in city buses. Hank Thomas was part of this organization. They were one of the many groups that contributed to the fight for racial equality.
And the system of segregation was a terrible, terrible system for people to live under. It controlled, if you were a black person, it controlled just about everything of your life. You couldn't go into a restaurant, you couldn't stay in a hotel, and so your life was made terrible each day.
You had to drink out of water fountains if they were public fountains with colored and white, because I'm sure the water would be segregated also.
You were not permitted by law and by the conduct of the white people in the United States to have an equal opportunity.
And as small as it was in that community, I could not go inside the post office. And the post office was just a little shabby place. But you couldn't walk inside. And I could never quite understand how could it hurt anyone, the stamps or anyone else, to go inside the post office.
And I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything in the city of Bloomington, Indiana.
I went to a segregated school. I went by bus 14 miles to get to a school that was in nowhere near as good a school as white children had.
I was determined to do something to fight it, but it prevented me from going to the best schools. Even though I did get a good education, I got a good education in spite of the hardships.
When I applied for a job as a coach and a teacher in the school system in Baltimore, Maryland, where I was living at the time that I retired from professional football, the superintendent of that department looked at me and said, "There's only 2 schools at which you can teach." And they were the 2 African-American high schools.
It made life very miserable for me. I grew up very, very poor. I grew up in a house that did not have indoor plumbing. We didn't have running water like we have today that you take for granted. We didn't have electric lights in our house. So I grew up very, very poor.
Also realizing that separate but equal didn't really mean what it said. It meant separate, but it wasn't equal.
Hank Thomas was born on August 29, 1941 in Jacksonville, Florida, and spent most of his childhood in St. Augustine. Even at an early age, he protested racial injustices. He corrected a white insurance man who addressed his aunt by her first name instead of her last. He took his books to the all-white library to read, where blacks were not allowed to check out books. At an older age, he participated in sit-ins at nearby all-white restaurants. Hank Thomas won a scholarship to an all-black college, Howard University. In college, he protested Congress in nearby all-white cinemas. He became a founder of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1960, which was a student arm of the Civil Rights Movement.
So I kept wondering, when would things change, or would they ever change?
Because of the segregated laws at the time, African Americans united in protest. Hank Thomas was one of the people who stood up and became a freedom rider.
Well, throughout history, not just the history in this country, but the history of people throughout the world, whenever people have lived under any kind of oppression, sooner or later, individuals will resist that. We had the same thing that happened in this country when the country was very young and it was a colony of England. The things that England was doing to the Americans were not things that the Americans appreciated, so that's the reason they had the Revolutionary War. So I'm just part of a long history of people who stand up and fight for what is right.
In one of his earlier freedom rides, Hank Thomas was arrested for refusing to wait in the colored waiting area at a bus station. Instead of facing charges, he was taken back to the station to face the angry mob that had gathered there.
There were a total of 3 police officers, 2 in the front and 1 in the back with me. The one in the back with me put his hands on his gun and said, "Nigga, get out of this car." I had to make a decision right away. If I stayed, he was going to shoot me. If I get out, that mob's going to get me, but I thought I may have had a better chance with the mob.
Fortunately, a World War II veteran rescued him from the mob. Shortly after, he participated in other freedom rides that were even more life-threatening.
The 1961 Freedom Rise was a turning point, one of the turning seminal points in our fight against state-mandated racism.
On May 4th, 1961, a group of freedom riders, including Hank Thomas, in place of his ill friend, boarded a Greyhound bus at Washington, D.C., headed to New Orleans. When the bus arrived in Anniston, Alabama, it was met with a violent mob of about 200 white citizens.
And the one thing he did was he locked the door so they couldn't get in, so they proceeded to rock the bus and knock out the windows, and finally, I guess this was the terminus point for his shift, another bus driver got aboard the bus and tried to drive out. We didn't know it at the time, but the bus tires had been slashed.
The bus was not able to make it very far, and Hank Thomas and the Freedom Riders' lives were in grave danger.
Again, this bus driver jumped out of the bus and he locked it so they couldn't get in, and when they couldn't get in, they broke out the remaining windows. And after a while, they worked themselves up into such a frenzy. Somebody got an incendiary device that we learned later on came from the Army base at Fort McClellan, shot it aboard the back of the bus through one of the broken windows, and within seconds, the bus started burning in the rear and filling up with nauseous smoke.
They pursued the bus until a bomb was thrown inside. The Freedom Riders escaped but were beaten by members of the surrounding mob.
We all were suffering from smoke inhalation, so somebody called the ambulance. In the state of Alabama, good people, at that time, the state of Alabama laws forbid a white ambulance driver from taking a black person or rendering medical aid to any black person. They could not do that. We got to the hospital staff said, "We cannot treat blacks in this waiting room. We will have to go around the other side of the building, or we were in no condition to move." And they would not give us any kind of treatment. And so our white brethren said, "We will suffer with the blacks." Once again, the word got out, and they finally started giving us aid. By this time, the mob is at the hospital. Hospital people locked the doors to the emergency room. And they started knocking on the doors, and finally they said, "Send out those freedom riders, or we're going to burn this place down."
After segregation was outlawed, Hank Thomas went on to serve in the Vietnam War, earning a Purple Heart. He became a successful businessman and franchised a Dairy Queen, a Burger King, 6 McDonald's restaurants, and 4 Marriott hotels. He frequently speaks about life during segregation and inspires young people today.
It was one of the most important decisions I ever made, and I am very, very proud to have participated in a movement that have changed this country and made life better for black people. I am very, very proud of what I did. I was arrested a total of 22 times in this country, and And I am very proud of each one of those arrests because it was done in order to make this country a better country for everyone.
Without Hank Thomas and the Freedom Riders' work during the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 may not have been passed, segregation would still exist today, and we would not have a black president.
It meant that my children would have a different world, that they could live in the world, doing things that I couldn't do when I was a child or when I was a young person.
Hank Thomas has spent his life repairing the world. Playing the hero, he stood up to make the world a better place and risked his life for the rights of others. He continues to make a difference by speaking to young people about the lessons of the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you, Hank Thomas, for making the world a better place for everyone.
If you see somebody who's being picked on, who's being bullied, you got to speak up and say that's not right. And just make this a wonderful country for everyone, regardless of their particular color. And the wonderful thing about this country today is we have more people of different color, different races, different religion, perhaps than any other country. And we all live in peace today.